On a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., an HOA Karen made a $2.3 million blunder that would result in an 8-year federal prison sentence. It all began with a set of bolt cutters and the incorrect military vehicle. Clang. The report of those cutters severing my security chain reverberated through the flawless suburban quiet like a series of gunshots. That metallic crack was the instant Bethany Kensington Wright transitioned from HOA president to federal offender in just 30 seconds. You see, while I was stationed overseas combating drug cartels, this power-crazed suburban tyrant determined that my unsightly vehicle had to go. What she was unaware of was that the Jeep was the property of a federal drug task force, packed with $347,000 in classified surveillance technology, and that I am the type of federal agent who excels at dismantling criminal syndicates. She believed she was taking some soldier's truck. In reality, she committed federal offenses that would evoke envy in cartel leaders. Willowbrook Estates. Imagine a picture-perfect suburban nightmare where every home is painted the identical shade of beige, sprinkler systems were on automated timers, and the scent of fresh mulch fails to conceal the odor of entitlement. The HOA dues were $150 per month to uphold community standards. In other words, paying a power-hungry Karen to make one's life a living hell. I am an Army Reserve MP who was recently admitted to a federal drug task force. Grandma Rose's home was intended to be my financial cushion. I planned to rent it out during my deployment, build equity, and pay tribute to the woman who raised me after my parents perished in a car accident when I was 12. That house is still redolent of her homemade tortillas and Bengay. Every groaning floorboard is imbued with memories of her teaching me the difference between right and wrong. Mijo, she would advise, you confront bullies, but you do it correctly. Enter Bethany Kensington Wright. Envision a 52-year-old real estate agent who operates a white Lexus SUV and literally measures grass height with a ruler. Her 7-year tenure as HOA president had transformed her into a suburban autocrat. Her husband, Carl, held a seat on the city council, which gave her a sense of being invulnerable. This woman dispatched violation notices for Christmas decorations still up in January. 2 weeks into my deployment, the email arrived in my inbox. Violation notice. Unauthorized commercial vehicle storage. My government-issued Jeep Wrangler, which was clearly marked with federal law enforcement insignia, was deemed an eyesore. Bethany's reading of the HOA covenants was that work vehicles were forbidden in residential driveways. Here is what she did not know. That Jeep held $200,000 worth of surveillance gear for ongoing cartel investigations, including GPS trackers, encrypted radios, and clandestine cameras, all federal property that necessitated departmental approval for relocation. The fine was set at $50 per day, mounting while I was dodging gunfire abroad. My sister Maya, a kind-hearted middle school teacher, attempted to reason with this suburban despot. She visited Bethany to clarify that I was deployed, presented copies of my military orders, and even proposed to conceal the Jeep with a tarp. Rules are rules, Bethany retorted, looking down on Maya as if she were an insect. If your brother is unable to adhere to basic community standards, perhaps this neighborhood is not a suitable place for your family. That telephone call from Maya still resounds in my mind. The sound of her voice trembling as she sat in our grandmother's kitchen. Tank, she threatened to place a lien on the house. She said Carl has connections at the school district, and that supporting you could jeopardize my job. Maya then uncovered the pattern. The Johnsons, with the husband being a Marine, were cited for his motorcycle being deemed excessively loud. Sarah Martinez, a Navy spouse with a deployed husband, received a fine because her garden gnomes were considered unprofessional. Every military family in Willowbrook was being targeted. But here is the crucial detail. Bethany's cited violations were entirely fabricated. I had Maya review the official HOA bylaws, which were tucked away in my grandmother's documents from when she purchased the house in 1987. Government vehicles were explicitly exempt. Emergency services, military, and law enforcement were all protected. Bethany was literally inventing rules, banking on the residents being too cowed or uninformed to verify. The community was gripped by fear. Neighbors exchanged hushed words over their fences, but were unwilling to challenge her publicly. Bethany had cultivated an environment where questioning her authority meant becoming her subsequent target. Carl's political influence made any resistance appear hopeless. It was then that I comprehended the true nature of the situation. This was not about parking regulations or property values. This was a campaign of organized harassment against military families, executed by a corrupt HOA board with political shielding. I recall the texture of sand between my teeth during that phone call with Maya. The smell of diesel fuel and anxious sweat mingling in 120-degree temperatures. The echo of my grandmother's voice in my memory. Stand up to bullies, but do it the right way. While I was serving my country overseas, working to keep drugs from entering American communities, some suburban princess believed she could seize my family's heritage through manufactured fines and scare tactics. Bethany Kensington Wright had just initiated a conflict with the wrong federal agent. She presumed she was contending with a defenseless military family. What she failed to grasp was that my specialty is dismantling criminal organizations, and her petty HOA scheme was about to be my next takedown. Bethany's subsequent action, which occurred 48 hours later, was a clear act of suburban warfare. A registered letter was delivered to Maya's mailbox, insisting on the immediate removal of the vehicle or its emergency towing within 24 hours. Not 48 hours, but 24. This woman was attempting to steal federal property while I was deployed abroad. The letter, with a carbon copy sent to Carl's city council office and the local police, alleged immediate health and safety violations and emergency neighborhood degradation. These were complete fabrications, but they were presented on official letterhead with legalistic jargon intended to intimidate. Maya called me from our grandmother's kitchen, and I could discern the panic in her voice mixed with the familiar creak of those antique floorboards. Tank, a tow truck is circling the block. The driver keeps eyeing your Jeep as if he's assessing it. The aroma of Grandma's vanilla candles could not hide the scent of fear in Maya's voice. This was psychological warfare, suburban style. It was at that moment I launched my initial countermeasure. I got in touch with JAG, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, military attorneys who excel at addressing constitutional infringements. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams reviewed my case file, and her expression shifted from professional curiosity to righteous anger. Rodriguez, this woman just threatened to steal federal law enforcement property. That isn't an HOA violation. That is a federal felony. Here is something that most people are unaware of. The Service Members Civil Relief Act does not merely shield military personnel from contract disagreements. It expressly forbids the harassment of a deployed service member's property. More critically, my Jeep is not just my personal vehicle. It is federal law enforcement equipment owned by the United States government. Williams promptly submitted a formal complaint to Base Command, setting in motion something wonderful, a federal military liaison review. All of a sudden, Bethany's little power play was now on the radar of individuals with genuine authority. But it was here that I uncovered the true twist, and it made the situation intensely personal. Maya began sifting through Grandma's old HOA papers, and within a pile of meeting minutes from 2019, she discovered irrefutable evidence. It was a letter from Bethany to the City Planning Commission, advising against military housing assistance programs in Willowbrook because transient military populations don't maintain long-term community investment standards. In essence, she had been trying to prevent military families from moving into our neighborhood for years. The feel of the aged paper crumbling between Maya's fingers as she photographed the proof. The sound of her sharp gasp as she understood the extent of Bethany's discrimination. Tank, she has been methodically targeting every military family that settles here. The Hendersons received violations for their son's bicycle being stored improperly. The Washingtons were cited for excessive noise when their baby cried during the night. This was not haphazard HOA overreach. This was organized discrimination with political support. You see, Carl had a development project in the works. It involved luxury condos that needed HOA approval for zoning variances. Military families, with their unsightly work vehicles and erratic deployment schedules, undermined the marketing angle of an exclusive community. Maya's teacher instincts went into high gear. She began contacting other targeted families, creating a network to document the abuse. Every concocted violation, every menacing letter, every scare tactic, she was unintentionally compiling a federal discrimination lawsuit. But Bethany escalated once more. And on this occasion, She overstepped a boundary that would come back to haunt her. The sound of expensive heels clicking on the pavement echoed through Maya's phone as Bethany carried out her own inspection of Grandma's house. She was recording every detail, taking pictures of my Jeep from various perspectives, and using a tape measure for distances. Your brother's military service doesn't give him a pass on community noncompliance, she remarked to Maya with that patronizing tone that makes you want to acquaint entitlement with reality. Perhaps your family should reevaluate whether this neighborhood is a good fit for your lifestyle. These were code words for, "We don't want your type here." My counterstrike was both swift and crippling. I remotely activated the GPS tracking and security systems in my Jeep, which are standard features for task force operations. The resulting data was beautiful. Bethany had trespassed on my property 17 times in 3 days, photographing federal law enforcement equipment without authorization. This was not merely harassment, it was potential espionage. When my task force supervisor, Captain Sarah Chun, was informed that some suburban HOA tyrant was conducting surveillance on federal drug enforcement equipment and menacing military families, her reaction was wonderfully blunt. "Rodriguez, how quickly do you want me to make this woman's life difficult?" The federal government was poised to introduce Bethany Kensington right to consequences she had never anticipated. Bethany's next action was born of pure desperation cloaked in suburban authority, and it almost shattered my family. 3 days following my JAG complaint, she contracted exec safe security to monitor compliance with community standards. 2 guards in a white SUV, with security emblazoned on its sides, began documenting my Jeep hourly, as if it were a terrorist threat. But that was not the primary issue. The main problem was the narrative they were spreading to the neighbors. Maya called me in tears, her voice faltering over a satellite connection from some remote desert location. "Tank, they're telling people you're dangerous. That having military vehicles in a residential zone poses security risks. Mrs. Patterson won't even look at me anymore." The sound of Maya's weeping mingling with the desert wind through my phone caused a cold, hard knot to form in my chest. These people were tarnishing my family's name while I was unable to protect them. My counter-response needed to be precise, but I was 8,000 miles away with restricted communication opportunities. I reached out to Captain Chun during my next approved call, detailing how private security was surveilling federal task force equipment. Her reply was not what I had anticipated. "Rodriguez, this is a delicate situation. If we intervene too aggressively, we'll lend credence to their assertions that your vehicle is a danger. We need to let them incriminate themselves." The small twist emerged when I remotely gained access to my Jeep's security system. Federal task force vehicles are equipped with more surveillance technology than most police precincts. This includes motion sensors, infrared cameras, GPS tracking, and automated photography of anyone who comes within 15 feet. The footage uncovered something that made my blood freeze. Bethany was not merely documenting supposed violations. At 1:43 a.m., security footage captured her using a flashlight to inspect my Jeep's interior through the windows, photographing dashboard instruments, and even trying to open the doors. She was attempting to gain access to classified federal surveillance equipment. But here is what truly alarmed me. She was not acting by herself. The footage depicted her indicating specific features to the security guards, who were then taking detailed photographs of federal communications hardware. The community's social fabric was fraying, and Maya was bearing the brunt of it. Parents at her school began to question whether a military family with security issues was suitable to be teaching their children. Her principal summoned her for a meeting to discuss community concerns. The smell of chalk dust and apprehension was palpable in Maya's voice during our subsequent call. "Tank, they are ruining my career." Bethany informed the PDA that military families introduce instability and security threats to neighborhoods. "She's using my profession against me." That is when I grasped that this was no longer just about my property. They were methodically wrecking my family's life, and I was powerless to prevent it from overseas. The feeling of helplessness tastes like sand and fury when you're sitting in a communications bunker, surrounded by the apparatus of war, while some suburban terrorist systematically dismantles your sister's life back home. Bethany's security personnel escalated by confronting Maya in person. The lead guard, a man who seemed like a failed police officer with a power complex, intercepted her while she was getting groceries. "Ma'am, we need to talk about your brother's military activities," he stated, obstructing her path to her car. That vehicle has equipment that could present risks to community safety. We must know what kind of operations he might be conducting from that residence. Maya, to her credit and with her teacher's intuition, began recording with her phone. Are you implying that my brother, who is serving overseas to protect our nation, is some kind of menace to American families? She inquired, her voice firm despite the quiver I could detect. The guard moved closer, a deliberate invasion of her personal space meant to intimidate. Military personnel sometimes carry their problems home. PTSD, weapons, surveillance gear. We are just ensuring the safety of the community. They were portraying me as a hazardous, potentially unstable veteran, a classic form of military discrimination masked as a concern for community safety. But Maya's recording captured something invaluable. The guard acknowledged that they were investigating the surveillance equipment in my vehicle. That admission just became key evidence in a federal espionage case. My countermove was executed through channels Bethany could never have foreseen. Captain Shin got in touch with Exec Safe Security's Federal Licensing Bureau, notifying them that their guards were performing unauthorized surveillance of classified government equipment. The guards were gone overnight, but their security firm was now under federal investigation for espionage-related activities. Bethany's reaction to losing her enforcers was sheer panic. She submitted emergency complaints to every agency she could find: police, the fire department, code enforcement, even animal control. But in doing so, she had just generated a paper trail that documented her fixation on federal property. The conflict was intensifying, and I was still stranded overseas while my family suffered the consequences. But Bethany was oblivious that she had just activated protocols that would bring the entire force of federal law enforcement upon her suburban domain. Bethany's desperation peaked at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and Maya's security camera captured every federal offense in high definition. The sound is one I will never forget. Clang, clang, clang. Bolt cutters severing my security chain. Each metallic snap resounded through the early morning suburban quiet like gunshots. My phone buzzed me awake in a deployment tent 8,000 miles away. Her voice was pure panic. Tank, she's cutting your locks. She has bolt cutters and a tow truck. And she's stealing your Jeep right now. Through Maya's phone camera, I observed Bethany Kensington Wright committing multiple federal felonies in real time. Her hair was messy, and she was still in her bathrobe. She had hired Discount Dave's towing with cash. No documentation, no inquiries. She was frantically telling them to load federal law enforcement property onto their flatbed. The tow truck driver glanced at the federal task force decals and began to retreat as if the vehicle were radioactive. Lady, this is government property with federal markings. I'm not touching this for any price. It's abandoned property. Bethany shrieked, her voice breaking with hysteria, spittle flying in the morning light. I am the HOA president with the legal right to remove community violations. That declaration, recorded on 3 separate security cameras, just became Exhibit A in a federal theft trial. My counteraction was swift and decisive. I contacted Captain Chun immediately through emergency protocols, activating procedures for the theft of federal law enforcement equipment. Within minutes, federal marshals were en route with lights and sirens to my grandmother's address. But here is the magnificent small twist. My Jeep's concealed GPS tracker and remote security systems were automatically documenting everything. Federal task force vehicles are equipped with kill switches, tracking devices, and cameras that activate upon unauthorized movement. The instant Bethany cut my lock, she initiated a federal alert that notified Homeland Security databases in 3 states. Maya continued to record as Bethany made her critical error. After the tow truck driver had fled, leaving rubber marks on the pavement in his rush to get away, she changed the locks on the community gate, effectively trapping my federal vehicle and preventing law enforcement from reaching it. If he wants his precious military truck back, he can adhere to proper HOA procedures, she yelled at Maya, brandishing the new keys like some unhinged suburban despot. Military service doesn't place him above community standards. A feeling of helpless fury washed over me as I watched this entitled suburbanite steal federal property while my sister stood there, documenting her public meltdown. The scent of diesel fuel and fear seemed to travel through the phone line. Federal task force vehicles contain automated tracking and alert systems that are activated by unauthorized tampering. Cutting locks or trying to move these vehicles initiates Homeland Security protocols, GPS tracking, and the dispatch of federal response teams. This is not a local crime. It is the theft of classified government equipment with a potential terrorism enhancement. Stealing federal law enforcement vehicles triggers automatic national security alerts and a federal task force response. It is not considered theft. It is considered potential terrorism. The community rebellion started when Mrs. Patterson saw Bethany's public outburst from her front window. This kind, elderly woman, who had lived through the Great Depression and lost 2 sons in the military, was not going to stand by while some HOA Karen tormented a deployed soldier's family. She contacted every neighbor, every veteran in Willowbrook, and every decent individual who had been quietly enduring Bethany's reign of suburban terror. By 10 a.m., my grandmother's house was encircled by protective neighbors who had formed a human barrier around the federal property. "This ends here, right now," declared Tom Henderson, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran whose own son had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan. "If you want that boy's vehicle, you'll have to get through 30 American veterans first." Maya's voice was steadier when she called me back, now bolstered by a wave of community support that made my throat tighten with thankfulness. "Tank, you have to see this. The entire neighborhood is here." Mr. Henderson brought his American flag. Mrs. Chun is preparing coffee for everyone. They are not budging. But Bethany's reaction to this community resistance was pure suburban fascism, dialed up to an extreme. She filed emergency complaints with every government agency she could find. She told the police that veterans were creating armed militias. She informed the fire department about alleged explosive risks from military equipment. She fabricated violations for code enforcement regarding unauthorized gatherings. She even contacted animal control, claiming that emotional support dogs were actually attack animals. Each false report constituted another federal crime. Making false statements about military personnel and federal property is subject to severe penalties under various laws. The tipping point was reached when federal marshals arrived at Willowbrook Estates and found that Bethany had changed the locks on the community gate, stopping federal agents from getting to their own stolen property. That constitutes obstruction of federal justice. Marshal Jennifer Torres, a no-nonsense federal agent who had apprehended cartel leaders and domestic terrorists, looked at the locked gate, and her expression changed from professional civility to a predatory intensity. "Ma'am, you have obstructed federal agents who are investigating the theft of government property. Open this gate now, or you will face more federal charges." Bethany's reply sealed her doom permanently. "I do not acknowledge federal authority over private HOA property. You people have no jurisdiction within my community." She had just waged war on the United States government while standing in her bathrobe. Game over. I arrived back in the States 72 hours later, still with the taste of desert sand and adrenaline in my mouth, to discover Maya in Grandma's kitchen, surrounded by enough evidence to bring down a small nation. But it was the scent that struck me first, not the vanilla candles or fresh tortillas of my grandmother. It was the smell of desperation and fear that had permeated these walls while I was away. "Tank, you need to see this before the feds arrive," Maya said, her hands shaking as she laid out documents on Grandma's dining table. "I found something that alters everything." The manila folders held 5 years of HOA financial records, meeting minutes, and correspondence that Maya had managed to obtain through what she referred to as her teacher network. But hidden within the pile was a document that made my blood run cold, a contract between Kensington Urban Holdings and Eastbrook Development Corporation, dated 6 months before I inherited Grandma's house. The subject line stated, "Willowbrook Estates Acquisition Strategy, Phase 2 Implementation." "Tank, they weren't just harassing military families at random," Maya whispered, her teacher instincts having turned her into an accidental investigator. "They were methodically clearing properties for a huge development deal." The texture of the old paper crumbled between my fingers as I absorbed the details. Carl's company had pre-sold 47 properties in Willowbrook to a national development corporation for luxury condos, properties they did not yet own, including Grandma's house. "Look at the target list," Maya said, indicating an appendix that made me want to hit something. "Every military family, every elderly resident, every individual who couldn't defend themselves against bureaucratic harassment, all designated for acquisition facilitation. The Hendersons, the Martinez family, Grandma Rose, all were targets in a systematic effort to compel sales at prices below market value. But here is the discovery that changed the entire situation. Bethany had been fabricating HOA violations. Maya presented the original 1987 HOA bylaws, the authentic ones, not Bethany's counterfeit versions. Military vehicles were not only permitted, they were explicitly protected under federal compliance mandates. Tank. She made up fake rules and relied on people being too afraid or uninformed to verify, Maya stated, her voice growing stronger. But there's more. The HOA's financial records exposed systematic embezzlement. Over a period of 3 years, $184,000 in community funds had been rerouted to Carl's development company through fictitious consulting contracts and community improvement projects that were never carried out. When HOA boards redirect community funds to personal enterprises without the approval of residents, it can constitute federal mail fraud if any communications cross state lines. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act comes into play when these offenses constitute a pattern of criminal activity that affects interstate commerce. HOA financial fraud that involves multiple properties and systematic targeting can lead to federal RICO charges. This is organized crime territory with sentences of 20 years. The smell of Maya's anxious sweat, mingled with her resolve, permeated the kitchen as she uncovered the final element. Tank. I believe they killed her. She showed me violation notices that had been sent to Grandma during her last weeks in hospice. Citations for failures in property maintenance and threats of legal action against a dying woman who was unable to even leave her bed. The stress of dealing with these fraudulent violations. Her blood pressure shot up each time one was delivered. The hospice nurse mentioned she repeatedly asked if we were going to lose the house. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. Mijo, don't let them take our home. I had assumed she was speaking deliriously due to her medication. She was trying to warn me. Maya's metamorphosis was complete. She was no longer the intimidated teacher being harassed by suburban despots. She had become a warrior, equipped with evidence and righteous anger. Tank, this isn't just about your Jeep anymore. This is about organized crime masquerading as community governance. They have been destroying families for financial gain. The balance of power had not merely shifted, it had been shattered. Federal prosecutors were about to be handed a RICO case that included fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and elder abuse. But the true revelation was that I was no longer fighting for my property. I was fighting for my grandmother's memory and for every family they had ruined. The war had just become personal in ways Bethany could never have foreseen. The command center materialized in Grandma's living room within 48 hours, and the irony of the situation was not lost on me. We were orchestrating the downfall of suburban despotism in the very same room where she used to berate telenovela villains. Maya had transformed into someone I had never witnessed before. The timid teacher had vanished, replaced by a strategic genius who was coordinating between federal agents, networks of veterans, and a legion of incensed neighbors. The aroma of serious government operations, burnt coffee, stress-induced sweat, and legal papers had permanently supplanted Grandma's vanilla candles. Captain Chin showed up with 2 federal prosecutors and sufficient legal might to overthrow a small country. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez laid out Maya's evidence across every available surface, shaking her head in astonishment. Rodriguez, I've handled cartel money laundering cases with less documentation than this. It was then that she clarified something that made my task force training click into place. During my federal crimes course, we learned about RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. At the time, I believed it was solely for gangsters and drug syndicates. It turns out that when suburban tyrants participate in methodical fraud and discrimination that spans multiple states, they are treated as a federal organized crime entity. Maya's evidence demonstrated a consistent pattern of criminal activity, embezzlement, fraud, and civil rights violations, all orchestrated between Carl's position on the city council and Bethany's authority within the HOA. The involvement of interstate commerce through Carl's development transactions established federal jurisdiction. The allies converging in Grandma's living room resembled a resistance force. Tom Henderson brought his network of Vietnam veterans, 12 men who had endured real wars and were not fazed by suburban corruption. Mrs. Patterson provided surveillance photographs, which included images of Bethany and Carl's late-night meetings at the community center. Maya's teacher union contributed something I had not anticipated: media expertise. Educators are skilled at explaining complex subjects to working families, and they had been eager for an opportunity to defend military families against discrimination. The sound of Maya's increasingly assured voice directing operations filled the rooms where Grandma once hummed Mexican folk songs. Observing my younger sister command federal agents and community volunteers finally eased a knot of tension in my chest. The financial warfare strategy was a personal matter for Maya. She had dedicated nights to reviewing the HOA records. Her teacher's mind identified patterns that reminded her of catching students who had cheated on several assignments. The systematic embezzlement was more than just theft. It was a breach of trust that offended her sensibilities as an educator. Tank, do you recall when Mom used to balance the family budget on this very table? Maya asked, gesturing to forensic accounting spreadsheets that detailed $184,000 in misappropriated HOA funds. She taught us that stealing from families is the most egregious type of crime. Forensic accountant Jennifer Walsh detailed how Carl's operation functioned, selling houses to out-of-state developers before compelling the current residents to sell. I recalled similar advanced fee fraud schemes from my financial crimes training, promising future property, taking money up front, and then manipulating events to deliver on the promise. Maya had found email exchanges between Carl and Eastbrook Development that discussed displacement schedules for properties they did not yet possess. The feeling of being violated was palpable. These individuals had intended to steal Grandma's house even before she had passed away. The ad hoc surveillance network merged my military expertise with the community's resolve. It included hidden cameras, coordinated patrols, and encrypted communications. Mrs. Patterson's front window was converted into a command post. Tom Henderson's garage stored the equipment, and Maya's house functioned as the communications center. The strategy for a recall election was born from Maya's experience teaching civics. She had always instilled in her students that democracy is effective only when citizens are engaged. Now, she was demonstrating it. Most people are unaware that HOA boards can be removed through resident petitions, which usually need the support of 25% to 33% of homeowners to initiate special elections. Maya's door-to-door efforts exposed the full extent of Bethany's tyranny. The Washingtons had proof of racial harassment. The Johnsons had documentation of discrimination against veterans. The elderly Kowalskis had been cited for excessive noise from their medical oxygen concentrator. Within 72 hours, Maya had gathered signatures from 67% of Willowbrook residents, demanding the immediate ousting of the board. The scent of victory was starting to mix with the desert dust that still clung to my uniform. The media strategy capitalized on Maya's connections within the teacher network. Stories of harassment against military families quickly spread through veteran communities, attracting the attention of Congress. 3 representatives called for federal hearings on systematic HOA discrimination. The discovery of insurance fraud was a product of pure investigative intuition. Maya uncovered claims that Bethany had filed for property damage purportedly caused by my Jeep, damage that had never occurred. From my task force background, I knew that insurance fraud is a charge federal prosecutors favor because it is straightforward to prove and comes with severe punishments. Civil rights lawyers came on board our coalition after examining the patterns of discrimination. The methodical targeting of military families was a breach of federal fair housing regulations. The elder abuse directed at Grandma activated further federal protections that were worth millions in damages. Maya's election as the interim HOA president was by unanimous consent at an emergency residence meeting. Her initial move was to freeze all accounts until the federal investigation was complete. Watching her wield the gavel in the same community center where Bethany had intimidated families for years, that was justice served cold. The stakes had grown beyond a personal quest for revenge. This case was setting a national precedent for prosecuting HOA corruption, safeguarding military families, and showing that organized communities can triumph over organized crime. But Bethany and Carl were oblivious to the fact that the net was tightening around them. Bethany's desperation became criminal at 3:17 a.m. when Maya's infrared cameras captured her in our backyard, frantically burning HOA financial records behind Grandma's tool shed. The acrid odor of burning paper and lighter fluid wafted into Maya's bedroom window, mingling with the scent of anxious sweat that seemed to shadow Bethany constantly now. She was hunched over a metal trash can, resembling some suburban sorceress as she fed documents to the flames with trembling hands. "Tank, she's destroying evidence in our yard," Maya whispered into her phone, observing through her bedroom window as Bethany struggled with matches in the pre-dawn gloom. "She's actually burning financial records while she's under federal investigation." My quiet preparations had been underway for weeks. Federal surveillance teams were documenting every desperate act, every crime driven by panic. But witnessing this entitled suburban princess destroying proof of her own corruption was pure poetic justice. But Bethany's sabotage intensified from property damage to personal attacks that triggered my task force instincts. The next morning, Maya found her car had been vandalized, with all 4 tires slashed. The words "military scum" were spray-painted in dripping red letters across the windshield. The sound of broken glass crunching under Maya's feet as she inspected the damage caused a cold, methodical resolve to settle in my chest. The feeling of helpless anger was one I knew well from deployment, watching adversaries harm people you are unable to protect. But this was not some distant battlefield. This was suburban terrorism directed at my own family. My countermeasure was professionally gratifying. I contacted Captain Chun, who made a single phone call that altered the entire situation. A federal protective detail was assigned to Maya and the other witness families. Not overt security, but agents who could seamlessly blend in during morning jogs and coffee shop runs. Bethany's surveillance was now being monitored by individuals with security clearances and the authority to make arrests. The community's reaction was beautiful. Tom Henderson set up veteran patrols, which made Bethany's late-night excursions impossible. The sound of combat boots on the pavement at 2 a.m. became the new soundtrack of the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson's kitchen was transformed into a command center, where she coordinated protection schedules over homemade cookies and righteous indignation. But Carl's desperation exposed a level of corruption far deeper than we had anticipated. Maya uncovered city council recordings in which Carl had exerted pressure on the police chief to disregard complaints from military families. His arrogant voice, echoing from Maya's laptop, triggered memories from my federal training. Back at the academy, they had educated us on conspiracy charges. When public officials use their authority to systematically infringe upon citizens' rights, it constitutes a federal civil rights conspiracy. Carl was not merely facilitating Bethany's actions. He was wielding government power to promote discrimination. "These military people introduce instability," Carl's recorded voice stated, dripping with entitlement. "Their vehicles, their schedules, their issues all impact property values and the character of the community." That recording just became Exhibit A in a federal conspiracy case. Bethany's attempt at bribery was captured by federal wire surveillance. She met Maya outside the grocery store with an envelope bulging with cash, her designer perfume failing to hide the smell of desperation. "This is $50,000 for your family," Bethany said, her hands shaking as she offered the envelope to Maya. "Military families deserve better neighborhoods anyway. Take this money. Find a place more fitting for your lifestyle." Maya, with her teacher's intuition, continued to record on her phone while federal agents observed from unmarked cars. From my training in federal crimes, I knew that attempted witness bribery carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. But Bethany was not finished committing federal offenses. She actually tried to bribe federal agents. Through a private investigator she had hired with embezzled HOA funds, Bethany made an attempt to offer money to federal agents to make this military situation go away. The sheer level of stupidity was almost refreshing. She believed that federal agents were as corrupt as those in her suburban domain. Federal agents do not just turn down bribes. They document them, record them, and add them to case files that guarantee decades in federal prison. Carl's political associates began to abandon him like rats from a sinking vessel. The mayor made a public statement distancing himself. City council members called for Carl's resignation. The stock price of his development company plummeted after allegations of corruption were reported by the state media. The smell of expensive cologne could not conceal Carl's panic during emergency city council meetings. He attempted to use city resources to undermine the federal investigations, asserting that outside military agitators were targeting successful local businesses. Every abuse of his office was being documented by federal agents who specialized in political corruption. Maya began to receive death threats, anonymous notes left under her windshield, and distorted voicemails warning that accidents happen to teachers who don't stay out of other people's affairs. The sound of Maya's voice trembling during those menacing calls ignited a primal, protective instinct within me. But my reaction was one of calculated federal precision. Threatening witnesses in federal investigations activates FBI terrorism task forces. Every anonymous threat was being tracked through phone records, handwriting analysis, and digital forensics that would impress the team on CSI. Bethany's last desperate act was to file false police reports, claiming that Maya was mentally unstable and plotting violent acts against community leaders. She actually informed the police that military families were organizing armed militias in Willowbrook. Filing false reports concerning federal witnesses during active investigations is not a local offense. It is federal obstruction of justice with terrorism enhancements. The beauty of federal patience was in watching Bethany methodically destroy herself, one crime at a time, while diligent agents compiled cases that would ensure she could never terrorize another family. Bethany's final, desperate move was a comprehensive media assault that exposed the true extent of her suburban criminal enterprise. The attack first targeted Maya's school. Anonymous complaints inundated the district office, alleging that she was indoctrinating children with anti-government military propaganda and fostering an unsafe atmosphere for civilian families. The sound of Maya's voice faltering during her frantic phone call made my hands clench into tight fists. "Tank, they're trying to ruin my career," she whispered from her deserted classroom. The familiar scent of chalk dust and youthful innocence was now corrupted by fear. "Parents are calling for my dismissal." The principal summoned me for an emergency meeting about my associations with unstable military elements. It was then that I found out Bethany had retained Morrison and Associates, the very PR firm known for rehabilitating politicians after corruption scandals. They were depicting me as a dangerous veteran suffering from PTSD who introduced military-level threats into peaceful suburban areas. The texture of these fabricated narratives felt distinct from the enemy propaganda I had encountered overseas. This was a personal war aimed at destroying families, not just completing missions. My silent groundwork had been laid over months, and Maya's documentation abilities had surpassed anything I had witnessed in federal training. She had recorded every threat, every falsehood, every coordinated assault on our family's reputation. But the smear campaign uncovered something that put my task force experience on high alert. Bethany was not acting alone. She had collaborated with HOA boards in 3 different states to create model policies for handling military family disruptions in suburban neighborhoods. This was not isolated harassment. It was systematic discrimination being spread nationwide. From my training in federal civil rights law, I knew that conspiracy cases that extend across state lines can lead to RICO charges. When organizations work together to breach citizens' constitutional rights, it is classified as organized crime. Maya's counterattack was beautifully effective. Her students and their parents organized a support rally that packed the school parking lot with American flags and signs that read, "We support Teacher Maya, and military families protect our freedom." The sound of third graders chanting, "Thank you, Mr. Tank's sister," echoed across the playground where Maya had devoted years to fostering young intellects. These children had a better grasp of justice than the suburban adults. But Bethany's desperation escalated to criminal levels of insanity when she employed private investigators to monitor Maya's every move. They tailed her to school, photographed her interactions with students, documented her trips to the grocery store, and even tracked her morning jogs. The sound of telephoto camera lenses clicking outside her classroom windows ignited a primal, protective instinct within me. During one of their safety checks, Maya found listening devices planted in her car. There were 3 separate surveillance gadgets, all of which could be traced back to Morrison and Associates through federal purchase records. The beauty of federal law lies in its clear stance on electronic surveillance. In my task force training, it was drilled into us that unauthorized surveillance devices are a violation of the Wiretap Act, which carries a 20-year federal sentence when it involves witness intimidation. Furthermore, planting such devices in vehicles falls under the purview of Homeland Security and can have terrorism enhancements. Captain Chin's reaction was swift and federally crushing. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division assumed control of Maya's case, handling the surveillance as a potential act of domestic terrorism. Suddenly, Bethany's suburban harassment was being scrutinized by individuals who hunt international criminals. The media frenzy reached a national scale when military advocacy groups learned of Maya's story. Members of Congress began to seek answers about systematic HOA discrimination against service families. The smell of national scrutiny was like pouring gasoline on Bethany's meticulously crafted suburban facade. Fox News contacted Maya. CNN requested interviews. Military Times featured front-page coverage of the suburban war being waged against military families. Carl's political career came to a public end during a live broadcast of a city council meeting. Federal agents executed search warrants while the cameras were rolling, carting away boxes of evidence as Carl remained motionless in his council seat. The look of utter humiliation was plain on his face as reality came crashing down. But it was Morrison and Associates who made the critical error that initiated federal hate crime investigations. They released a community safety report asserting that military families were associated with higher rates of crime, domestic violence, and substance abuse in suburban areas. It was filled with fabricated statistics, false data on veteran crime, and deliberate misinformation intended to provoke discrimination against a protected group. Maya was reviewing the report when I witnessed her teacher's instincts morph into righteous anger. Tank, they have just attacked every military family in America with falsehoods designed to make communities turn against veterans. Publishing false information to stir up discrimination against military families is a violation of federal hate crime laws. When this is done systematically for profit across multiple states, it becomes racketeering with enhancements for civil rights conspiracy. The federal investigation grew to encompass 17 states as other military families stepped forward with similar accounts of harassment. Maya's methods of documentation became the standard for federal prosecutors constructing RICO cases against corrupt HOA networks. Maya started to receive emails of support from military spouses all over the country who shared their own experiences with fabricated violations, coordinated harassment, and systematic efforts to push service families out of suburban neighborhoods. The sound of Maya's increasingly self-assured voice as she collaborated with federal attorneys filled the rooms where our grandmother once shared stories about confronting bullies. My younger sister had transformed from a victim into a national champion for the rights of military families. They believed they were up against one teacher and one soldier, Maya remarked, surrounded by federal case files that detailed patterns of nationwide discrimination. In reality, they were declaring war on every American family that serves this country. The public showdown was imminent, and it was going to be federally magnificent. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never witnessed such a scene. It was filled beyond the fire code capacity, with federal agents positioned along the walls, news cameras from 6 different stations, and military families from 3 states who had traveled for hours to see suburban justice served. The atmosphere was thick with a mix of righteous anger, the smell of stale coffee, and the electric charge of federal law enforcement preparing to show why one does not steal government property. Members of Congress occupied the front row, taking notes for forthcoming hearings on discrimination against military families. Bethany made a fashionably late entrance in her white Lexus, driving up to a line of protesters brandishing signs that read, "Military Families Matter," and "Prosecute HOA Terrorists." The click-clack of her designer heels on the pavement was completely muffled by veterans chanting, "Thank you for your service," a sentiment directed at Maya, not her. She walked in like a dethroned tyrant making a final defiant stand, with Carl trailing behind her, his posture broken like a man staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. A palpable sense of sheer panic emanated from both of them as they faced a room filled with the families they had systematically tormented. Maya was the first to speak at the podium. No longer the terrified teacher being harassed by suburban despots, she had transformed into something formidable, a national advocate whose voice now resonated with the weight of federal support and congressional focus. For 5 years, these individuals have used their positions to wage a war against military families, Maya declared, her words amplified by speakers that broadcasted her speech live on social media. They concocted rules, misappropriated funds, and organized discrimination campaigns that betrayed every principle this nation upholds. A wave of thunderous applause swept through the community center, so powerful that it made the windows rattle. Federal prosecutor Rebecca Martinez then came forward, accompanied by boxes of evidence that encapsulated months of investigation into what she termed organized suburban crime. Her voice was imbued with the kind of federal authority that makes criminals understand their time is up. The United States government has gathered overwhelming evidence of a criminal conspiracy that includes theft of federal property, violations of civil rights, witness intimidation, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice, she stated, each charge landing with the force of a judicial hammer. Tom Henderson spoke on behalf of the veteran community, his voice, seasoned by his time in Vietnam, shaking with emotion. My son served 3 tours to protect the freedoms of this country. These people believed they could disrespect that sacrifice for their own financial gain. Today, they will find out they were mistaken. But the most impactful moment was mine to deliver. As I neared the podium, I felt the presence of my grandmother, her words echoing in my memory. Confront the bullies, mijo, but do it the right way. This was the right way. Bethany Kensington Wright believed she was merely cutting the locks on some soldier's personal truck. I stated, my voice slicing through the complete silence. What she was actually doing was interfering with an active federal drug operation, compromising classified surveillance equipment, and stealing property that belonged to the United States government. A collective gasp filled the room, sounding as if all the air had been drawn out of the building. That Jeep was equipped with surveillance technology valued at $347,000 and contained evidence from ongoing cartel investigations that stretched across 4 states. When she cut those locks at dawn, she didn't just commit theft. She jeopardized national security operations that worked to keep drugs off American streets and to protect American families. Bethany's face turned the color of aged concrete as the full magnitude of her federal blunder became apparent. She had escalated from being a suburban bully to someone who had meddled with national security. But her most egregious crime was not stealing my vehicle. I went on, feeling years of suppressed anger transform into a cold, judicial resolve. Her true crime was waging a systematic war against military families, using government corruption to steal from the community that had placed its trust in her, and believing that suburban entitlement was superior to federal law. The audience erupted into a standing ovation. Cries of "Lock her up" mingled with shouts of "Justice for our heroes." As federal agents moved closer to their targets, Federal Marshal Jennifer Torres acted with a practiced efficiency that came from years of arresting individuals who thought they were beyond the reach of the law. She walked up to Bethany's seat with handcuffs and an air of federal authority that could not be negotiated or bribed away. Bethany Kensington Wright, you are under arrest for the theft of federal law enforcement property, conspiracy to violate civil rights, embezzlement of community funds, witness intimidation, and obstruction of federal justice. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut reverberated through the speakers as cameras recorded the moment when suburban tyranny collided with federal repercussions. Bethany's expression changed from defiance to the dawning horror that her suburban domain could not shield her from federal prison. Carl attempted to escape through a back exit, just like the coward he had always been, but he ran directly into federal agents who had foreseen that exact move. His arrest was less theatrical, but just as fulfilling to witness, as corruption met its inevitable accountability in real time. The federal protection afforded to military and law enforcement equipment had become a stark lesson. These are not merely vehicles. They are classified government assets, safeguarded by laws that include mandatory minimum sentences. When suburban terrorists interfere with federal operations, they learn that local corruption will be met with federal consequences with mathematical certainty. Maya was interviewed live by national media. Her journey from a terrorized teacher to an advocate for military families spurred congressional action. This demonstrates that the organized harassment of military families is a federal crime. She declared to the cameras broadcasting to millions. No HOA board, regardless of its level of corruption, is above the United States Constitution. The taste of victory was more gratifying than all the memories of Grandma's kitchen, combined with the satisfaction of seeing bullies realize that federal law does not bend. 18 months later, I was standing in Grandma's kitchen, reviewing the final sentencing report, and I could almost hear her voice saying, "Justice served the right way, mijo." Bethany was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, along with an order to pay $647,000 in restitution to the families she had harmed. The federal judge's remarks became renowned in legal communities. Your systematic harassment of military families is a form of domestic terrorism disguised as community governance. This court will not stand for suburban tyranny. Carl was given a 6-year sentence and a lifelong ban from holding public office. His development empire completely crumbled, resulting in $3.2 million in community settlements, which guaranteed that every family they had harassed was compensated for years of hardship. But the most significant victory was seeing our neighborhood change from a place dominated by fear into a community that looks out for its members. As the democratically elected president, Maya transformed the HOA's governance, introducing bylaws that have become the national standard for protecting military families. The scent of fresh hope took the place of the stale atmosphere of corruption as she introduced the Willowbrook Military Family Bill of Rights, which integrated federal protections into community law. The Veteran Memorial Park is now located where Bethany's house once stood, which was seized through federal asset forfeiture and repurposed by a community vote. Children now play on swings where suburban despotism once prevailed, their laughter echoing across grass that grows freely, unmeasured by rulers. The Rodriguez Foundation for Military Family Rights became Maya's new purpose. She left her teaching career to assist families across the country in combating HOA discrimination, using our case as the model for federal civil rights litigation. Her methods of documentation are now part of the curriculum at FBI training academies. Grandma's house transformed into a command center for military family advocacy. The kitchen where she taught us about confronting bullies now serves as the venue for strategy meetings with congressional aides, constitutional lawyers, and families engaged in their own suburban conflicts. The practical effects surpassed all expectations. New congressional laws now mandate HOA financial transparency and safeguard military families from systematic harassment. The Tank Rodriguez Act establishes federal supervision of community governance, with criminal sanctions for discrimination against service members. Knowledge that most people never acquire became our contribution to American families. Military personnel have constitutional rights that supersede local regulations. HOA boards can be removed by resident petitions that require as few as 25% of homeowners. Federal law considers systematic discrimination to be organized crime, which is punishable by decades in prison. Military families possess federal rights that no HOA can nullify, and communities hold the power to oust corrupt boards when they unite and work together. The National HOA Corruption Database has recorded over 400 similar cases since our story gained widespread attention, leading to federal investigations that have shielded thousands of military families from suburban terrorism. Property values in Willowbrook surged by 31% after the corruption was rooted out, demonstrating that justice is economically beneficial and that ethical governance draws in high-quality residents. Military families now actively choose to live in our community, confident that they will be protected and honored. Maya's evolution into a national advocate brought unforeseen happiness. She married Captain Sarah Chen's brother, David, a Navy veteran who relocated to Willowbrook because our story showed that military families could triumph over corruption. Their wedding reception was held in the same community center where we had witnessed federal justice being served live. I found my own happiness with Elena Martinez, the federal prosecutor who had helped construct our case. She accepted a transfer to local operations, and we purchased the house adjacent to my grandmother's. Waking up each morning in the neighborhood we fought to save feels like a daily victory. The Rodriguez Military Scholarship Fund, established with the proceeds from the lawsuit settlements, has enabled 23 military children to attend college. Each graduation ceremony serves as a reminder that the bravery of one family can transform entire communities and open up opportunities for the next generation. Mrs. Patterson, now 91 and still the moral compass of the neighborhood, cuts the ribbon at every community gathering. "Your grandmother always knew you would do something remarkable," she says to me at park dedication ceremonies, her eyes shining with contentment. "She just didn't realize you would end up saving the entire neighborhood." The moment that made it all worthwhile occurred during our first annual Freedom Day celebration. Hundreds of military families congregated in the park where Bethany's tyranny once held sway, exchanging stories of their victories over suburban corruption. The sound of children's laughter blended with the pride of veterans. The smell of barbecue and freedom filled the air that had once been tainted by fear. The feeling of Maya's hand in mine as we observed families gathering in safety in the community that Grandma cherished. But my favorite moment occurs every morning when I see the American flag flying over homes where military families reside without the fear of harassment. This is the taste of victory. Justice has been served, the community has been healed, and there is the knowledge that bullies can be overcome when good people unite and fight back.